Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Wednesday, March 12th, day 523 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our New York reporter Luke Tress and our longtime New York stringer, Catherine Prince. Hello to you both, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda.
Hi, Amanda. Good to be here.
Always a pleasure. I haven't seen either of you in person for many years. And Luke, I understand you will be joining us in our Jerusalem office pretty soon for a short visit. Catherine, I'm not sure when I'll see you again, but it is such a pleasure to see you here on the podcast today. So listeners, we are dedicating the entire episode to the anti-Israel protest movements on campuses and the subsequent flare-ups of anti-Semitism since October 7th, 2023. We are going to specifically look at Columbia University in New York, which has become basically a focal point for all of this since Hamas's October 7th massacre of 1,200 in southern Israel, plus 251 hostages that were taken to Gaza, including some 24 who are still living in captivity today. So Catherine and Luke have been covering this saga for the past 17 months, and now, with the arrest of pro-Palestinian activist Mahmoud Khalil from Columbia University, the tensions have reached an ever higher boil. So we're going to discuss how we got here and much, much more when we're back. U.S. federal authorities on Friday announced the cancellation of $400 million in grants and contracts with New York's Columbia University due to campus anti-Semitism. The cuts marked the most significant action yet taken by the Trump administration in its planned crackdown of anti-Jewish discrimination on universities. This week, on Monday, President Donald Trump announced on his Truth Social platform, quote, ICE proudly apprehended and detained Mahmud Khalil, a radical foreign pro-Hamas student on the campus of Columbia University. This is the first arrest of many to come. So just for a little bit of background, Khalil was born and raised in Syria, and his grandparents were apparently from Tiberias, which is near the Sea of Galilee. And Khalil is one of the main faces of the pro-Palestinian protests on Columbia University. These protests, of course, at points brought Columbia University to a standstill. So according to a CNN report, a federal judge in New York has blocked any efforts by President Trump's administration to deport Khalil, who has a green card and is married to a U.S. citizen. And of course, there will be a conference later on Wednesday, according to court documents, to determine a little bit more about his fate. So, Luke, first of all, let's just discuss why was he arrested this week?
So he was arrested on Saturday night at campus housing. He recently graduated, but he was still on campus housing. According to some legal documents his lawyer filed, some federal agents showed up at his housing place when him and his wife came home and detained him there. And there haven't been formal charges filed, but during a press briefing today, the White House press secretary said he was detained for distributing pro-Hamas propaganda, and that appeared to be a reference to a protest last week at Barnard College. Barnard is an affiliate of Columbia, and the protesters go back and forth between the two groups. So at this protest last week, the protesters were distributing pamphlets from, it said, the Hamas media office. They also handed out pictures of Hassan Nasrallah, who was the former head of the Hezbollah terror group. So they said he was detained for pro-Hamas propaganda, which it's important to note is covered by free speech, but it still can run afoul of immigration law. You can be deported, according to some experts I talked to, you can be deported for espousing terrorist activity, even if it is covered by free speech. And he's a green card holder, which gives him more protections than if he was here on a visa. But even green card holders are still considered aliens in the U.S. and can still be deported under this law.
So, Catherine, you and I have been discussing the issue of free speech for a long time, but the actual targeting of students, immigrant students, by President Trump is rather new. What do you know about this targeting specifically?
I think what changed is the frustration that we've seen over the past 17 months of Colombia administration in particular not enforcing its rules and not enforcing what we've talked about, time, place, manner restrictions. I think there is also perhaps an undercurrent of the current administration wanting to send a message about anti-Semitism, but also about speech and protest in general. I think there's it's wrapped up, a lot of issues wrapped up in this together.
So, Luke, the matter of the funding and this targeting of the immigrant students is all part of a broader Trump plan to crack down, of course, on anti-Semitism. What can you tell me about this broader plan?
So there's really been this huge offensive by the Trump administration in the last few weeks. So they issued a warning to Colombia, we're going to cut your funding. The protests continued, and then they cut the funding. They said our anti-Semitism task force, which is an agency Trump set up soon after he took office, they're visiting 10 campuses around the country that are suspected of abetting anti-Semitism on campus. Colombia is one of them. And in another measure, yesterday, they sent a letter to 60 campuses around the country saying they were being investigated for Title VI complaints, which is a civil rights statute that protects Jewish people. So these things all happened pretty quickly. The letter said they were being investigated and warned them about it. And there's been effects already for a lot of campuses beyond Colombia. Harvard and Penn have frozen hiring because their funding is threatened. Harvard, which is the wealthiest university in the country, is worried about its funding, which is a big deal. UCLA set up a new anti-Semitism task force. So it's this big offensive. Universities, I think, don't really know how to handle it, and they're kind of scrambling and worried about what's going to happen.
Okay, I want to now take us a little back in time and discuss the protest movement on Columbia University specifically. So only students are allowed on campus, as far as I understand it. So both of you have been reporting this out, but kind of secondhand in a way, correct? Meaning you've been speaking with students who were at these protests, but since nobody could actually get on campus, how much of the protests have you seen yourselves? Catherine, let's start with you on this.
So in the beginning, when about, I think the first protest that was anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian, took place just shortly after October 7th. Campus, when it did go on lockdown, some of that reporting then either was inside the craft center or in the School of Social Work. I was able to get into there. I've been on campus twice, getting access through, you had to go through the media relations. They will escort you onto campus. That was on the October 7th anniversary. There's been a lot of protesting, I'm sure Luke has seen too, outside of campus, like right outside the main gate. So it's both. There'll be protesters outside and inside, up towards the medical school. Same thing. They've had students kind of walk out and do protests there as well.
Luke, how much have you been able to witness yourself of these anti-Israel protests?
So I haven't been able to get on campus recently, but I've been off campus pretty often. So a lot of the times, because of both restrictions on protests on campus, which the protesters often ignore, but there still are the restrictions there. But so sometimes they will start on campus and then go off campus. And then the protest groups at Columbia often collaborate with off-campus protest groups. So a lot of times they're starting on campus and then walking off campus to the main gates. So I mostly see those protests, which are right outside the campus gates.
Yeah. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, Luke, you and I spoke this week, earlier in the week, and you said that there was meant to be a widespread protest on Tuesday. Do you have anything to report about Tuesday's protest?
Yeah, so National Students for Justice in Palestine, so one of the campus groups at Columbia is Students for Justice in Palestine of Columbia. And then the national group, NSJP, announced nationwide protest plans for Tuesday. They called on students to walk out of class, to take over central parts of campus, and to assert our mass power, or something, I think is how they phrased it. So those protests are happening now. In New York, there's a good number of protesters in Washington Square Park, which is downtown. It's near the NYU campus, so I know NYU students are there. Some Columbia Jewish Voice for Peace, which is an anti-Zionist group, they're protesting on campus on Tuesday also. And some Columbia professors have reportedly canceled class for the day. So there's stuff happening today. There was 2 protests yesterday. One we covered, one happened outside Columbia. And then tomorrow, when Khalil is having his hearing at a federal courthouse in New York, there's going to be a big protest outside the courthouse tomorrow morning also, or Wednesday morning also.
Right. Just to clarify for our listeners, because of the time change, we are recording Israel's late Tuesday, just to clarify in terms of today, tomorrow, yesterday, all that kind of stuff. Okay, let's go to a short break, and then we're going to drill into this a little bit more. And we're back. All right. Let's talk specifically about the Khalil case. As Luke mentioned earlier, he was arrested for distributing, or at least allegedly distributing, Hamas propaganda material. Luke, you and I were talking about this issue also earlier in the week, how you obtained some documentation that this Hamas material was being distributed at these protests. Can you tell us what kind of material you saw?
Yeah, so some Jewish students who were at the scene shared with me some of these pamphlets that were passed out. The label on it said, it was in English, the label on it said the Hamas Media Office. I don't know where exactly it came from, but there were pamphlets, and it was Hamas's justification for the October 7th attacking and their rationale for laying out the attack. And like as we said, they were also passing out Hezbollah stuff. Some of them had stickers with Sinwar on it, the Hamas leader. At least one of them had a t-shirt with Sinwar's face on it. So yeah, this was the stuff at Barnard that appeared to be the immediate precipitant for the arrest of Khalil.
Now, Catherine, I want to return to the idea of free speech. And this is something that has come up again and again. You've spoken with countless people about this issue and the limitations of free speech, et cetera, et cetera. So tell me a little bit about what you've learned over this past year and a half of war.
So what I've learned is that, and if we're going to use Colombia as the example, had the protesters or had those protested been limited to, say, the main quad of the campus, then as offensive as people might have found it or supporting it, that would have been well within their purview. And the issues really started when they took this speech and are using the concept of free speech. Some people I spoke with said they were hiding behind it, but to go through the libraries, to take over Hamilton Hall, the recent one at Barnard, much of the material that Luke mentioned had started to appear, I think this fall semester, you already started seeing the images, the pamphlets come out. And that's where, when we talk about time, place, manner, it's the time of that protest, the manner in which they're doing it. And of course, you can have those restrictions. The U.S. has a really broad view, though, of this. And even though Columbia is a private entity and could curtail these protests perhaps further than, say, a public school like the City University of New York, the courts really do recognize those broad free speech protections. Generally, they'll recognize them even on a campus like Columbia. And that's what gets really difficult this issue is really difficult. I think that you're going to find either during his hearing and there are subsequent arrests.
Luke, we, of course, are hearing a lot of support from Jewish leaders for Mahmoud Khalil and his case. What are you seeing so far in terms of the Jewish support for Mahmoud Khalil, who, again, is one of the leading faces of the pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel protest movement on these campuses in New York?
Yeah, so leftist Jewish groups, some of them are saying things like, we condemn the rhetoric at a lot of these protests, but we're opposed to deportation for speech. So kind of the usual cast of characters you would expect, like if not now, JFREJ, which are two leftist groups, they're kind of predictably behind Khalil. Some other groups kind of a little to the left of center, like the Zionist movement, have also spoken out about it because it's like this commitment to civil rights in the Jewish community. So it's I think a very difficult area for a lot of groups to comment on. And then some other groups like the ADL and AJC, they're kind of in the middle. They've said kind of things like there's a due process. AJC just put out a statement right before we talked, kind of saying there's due process. We abhor the speech that was here, but there's due process, and if it comes out that he should be deported, then he can be deported. So yeah, it's a tricky situation for, I think, a lot of Jewish groups to navigate right now.
Right. And it's not only the free speech, it's also the immigrant issue, which of course gets a lot of Jews really, really, really concerned. Catherine, can you speak to this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for the immigrant situation is because here, Jews themselves, obviously, around the world have benefited from immigration, are heavily involved in helping some of the aid groups right now, whether it's Catholic charities or highest, and all of these. And so there's a bit of a fear that this might be being used as the first step in going after any immigrant whose speech does not, that this administration doesn't support. And I think also, to Luke's point with the free speech issue, there's concern with the really diehard free speech organizations that this isn't just about what's happened at Columbia, but that this is maybe a door into further speech restrictions as a whole, that it could boomerang. So you might support this particular action, but it might come back and hurt you in a different way. I think that's why it's so fraught.
And then, of course, we have to think about the students on campuses, specifically the Jewish students, and how they are weathering this really terrible avalanche of hate that they did not sign up for when they decided to matriculate to these universities. So have either of you spoken with any Jewish students on campuses recently?
Yeah, I think a lot of the pro-Israel students on campus are satisfied with this, I would say. They're happy to see the Trump administration cracking down. But then there's also Jewish students who are against this. Like I said, there was a protest on campus today by JVP and other left-wing Jewish students on the Columbia campus who are against this. So I think the kind of pro-Israel students who have been involved in counter-protesting and stuff like this support the Trump administration pressuring the university and doing things like this. But as always, there are also Jewish students on the other side who are against this and are, I think, upset and fearful about where this could go.
Right. Two Jews, at least three opinions. Catherine, have you spoken with any Jewish students recently yourself?
Yes. And I would say it's pretty much, what Luke is saying. I think there are students who also might not be supportive of the administration, but because they feel that they have just been left to fend for themselves and have been attacked and harassed. That's documented in that enormous anti-Semitism task force report. Wherever they fall on the political spectrum, feel relieved that something's happening and that maybe it didn't have to come this far had Columbia acted last October to just enforce its own rules. I think that there would have been, a lot more support for that and a lot of relief.
So listeners, please check out our live blog for more updates on this issue. And of course, we are covering the issue of anti-Semitism on campuses as we have been, both of you, for the past year and a half, and hopefully not for very much longer. So Luke, Catherine, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.